face of great perils never before encountered, our strong purpose is to protect and to perpetuate the integrity of democracy. For this we muster the spirit of America and the faith of America. We do not retreat. We are not content to stand still. As Americans, we go forward in the service of our country by the will of God.
For Roosevelt, a third term in office as Europe looked into the abyss. Roosevelt's return to the White House for a third term broke a sacred tradition in American politics. Roosevelt believed the international crisis justified his continuing in power, but the love of the game was also a challenge to him. He would do what no other president had done. With hindsight, Roosevelt can be portrayed as a president given to bold actions, who delighted in the exercise of power, especially in foreign affairs. But he was also a cautious man who was deeply sensitive to the ebb and flow of public opinion. It was impossible to tell whether his caution and regard for public opinion were evidence of his commitment to the democratic process or more a matter of political calculation. At a time when the future of the free world hung in the balance, Roosevelt resorted to the shifting tactics and manipulation of the American system, which were his characteristic. One of those who enjoyed Roosevelt's confidence was Turner Catledge of the New York Times.
Well, FDR's challenge, as far as the war was concerned then, was to convince his country, or to solidify his country, to take a solid country into the war, an undivided country into the war. At that time, it was still divided, and he seemed to be extra cautious. That was his method of operating in the first place. He was a manipulator. He's trying to manipulate the country. He was nudging the country into war. And people wanted him to shove it into the war or to lead it into the war, and that he was not doing.
Britain stood alone against the Axis powers. Her morale was good, but her resources were fast running out. A deadly submarine war in the Atlantic threatened the lifeline on which she depended for food and war material. Churchill urged Americans to open their eyes to the danger the world was in. Give us the tools, he said, and we will finish the job. Choosing his words carefully, Roosevelt took up the challenge.
If Great Britain goes down, the Axis powers will control the continents of Europe and Asia and Africa and Australasia and the high seas. And they will be in a position to bring enormous military and naval resources against this hemisphere. It is no exaggeration to say that all of us in the Americas would be living at the point of a gun. We know now that a nation that can have peace with the Nazis only at the price of total surrender. The people of Europe who are defending themselves do not ask us to do their fighting. They ask us for the implements of war, the planes, the tanks, the guns, the freighters, which will enable them to fight for their liberty and our security. There is no demand for sending an American expeditionary force outside our own borders. There is no intention by any member of your government to send such a force. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself. There will be no bottlenecks in our determination to aid Great Britain. No dictator, no combination of dictators will weaken that determination by threats. I believe that the Axis powers are not going to win this war.
Public demonstrations against Roosevelt's war policy disturbed him. Some, no doubt, were communist-inspired, as Germany had not yet attacked Russia. But they seemed to indicate that America was still a divided nation. Woodrow Wilson's fate after bringing America into World War I continued to haunt him, and his opponents played on public memories of American losses in that war, losses which now seemed an unnecessary sacrifice. But Roosevelt's re-election in 1940 enabled him to move more openly to aid Britain. He found less need to resort to subterfuge, and there was greater urgency in the deteriorating situation. He submitted a daring proposal, the Lend-lease bill, intended to increase the flow of material to Britain. It was, he argued, a means whereby America could avoid fighting herself, let Britain do the job, as Churchill had said. One opponent of the bill was Joseph Kennedy, a former ambassador in London, whose hostile attitude towards Britain was well known.
The lease-lend bill seeks to confer upon the President authority unheard of in our history. I am unable to agree with the proponents of this bill that it has yet been shown that we face such immediate danger as to justify the surrender of the authority and responsibility of the Congress. After there has been a debate, and a bill, whatever it may be, becomes part of our law, I think the duty of every American citizen is plain. All of us must rally behind the President so that he may carry on with a nation which has debated in the democratic manner, has acted in the democratic manner, and is united in the cause of preserving our own democracy.
The Lend-lease Act, I regard it as almost a declaration of war. I regard it perhaps more so than Roosevelt seemed to regard it himself. But once Congress passed the Lend-lease Act, we were in the war. Its passage was made easier by the fact that the country was already geared up economically, in terms of employment, in terms of materials, already geared up to producing that material. What were they going to do with it? So he had a built-in lobby, if he needed it, to see that that bill went through. He had an industrial lobby. He had an emotional lobby, people who wanted to aid the British. He had his own determination to nudge the country into war, and that was a big shove. The British had established in Washington a purchasing commission. They were buying material, and contracts were being made to supply the material on a cash and carry basis. They pay the cash, and they had to haul it away. It came to the point where they had no cash. They not only had liquidated their assets in the United States, but also in a substantial part of Latin America, especially in Argentina. And they were absolutely exhausted. They couldn't go any further. And how they're going to keep supplying the British without the cash was the question. Somebody came up, I don't think it was he, I'm sure it was not, came up with the idea of the Lend-lease, of lend them material, just charge it to them on the books. And if we got in the war, we'd get it back. If we didn't get in the war, they could finally pay for it. And that was going to include everybody, not only the British, but also the Russians. The Russians got an enormous amount of Lend-lease.
Lend-lease bill passed Congress by wide margins in March 1941. Britain would not have to pay for the war equipment borrowed from America until after the war, which meant that the economic resources of America were committed to defeating the Axis powers. The bill also stimulated war production for America's own use should the need arise. With such convincing backing from the people, Roosevelt was able to move further in manipulating the American public towards active participation in the conflict.
After the Lend-lease was passed and they started manufacturing material, then they had to deliver it. The ability to carry it away was decreasing greatly because of the U-boat activities in the Atlantic. So how to get it to its destination became quite a problem, quite a question. Manipulated around to get an excuse for delivering it that would be in terms of the defense of the United States. Then they set up a convoy system. Well, once they instituted the convoy system, which Congress did, to protect the goods on their way to the destination, that was another step into the war. We were already knee-deep in the war by that time, and especially so when Roosevelt gave up orders to shoot to kill if necessary to carry those goods through. And that he did. Also, I'm quite positive that he was looking for a substantial incident.
Roosevelt's use of executive power to negotiate agreements with Denmark and Iceland was covered, he argued, by the Monroe Doctrine. No one quarreled with that. Churchill welcomed the presence of American forces in Iceland as part of the strategic defense of the West. It made more actual the friendship which he and Roosevelt had forged on a personal basis at a famous meeting in mid-Atlantic. Roosevelt, like Churchill, enjoyed being at sea in big ships. Earlier in their careers, both men had served their navies. A charter for the freedom of the world had been the result of that meeting. Churchill never fully understood America's political system, but he left Roosevelt impressed with the president's determination to work towards their common objective, and some of Churchill's fighting spirit rubbed off onto America's commander-in-chief.
On your first cruise, you met the Bismarck, and on your second, you met the illustrious President of the United States, who is one of the men who will take the greatest part in shaping the immediate future of our civilization.
The Axis powers can never achieve their objective of world domination unless they first obtain control of the seas. That is their supreme purpose today, and to achieve it, they must capture Great Britain. We shall give every possible assistance to Britain and to all who with Britain are resisting Hitlerism or its equivalent with force of arms. Our patrols are helping now to ensure delivery of the needed supplies to Britain. All additional measures necessary to deliver the goods will be taken. Therefore, with profound consciousness of my responsibilities to my countrymen and to my country's cause, I have tonight issued a proclamation that an unlimited national emergency exists and requires the strengthening of our defense to the extreme limit of our national power and authority. The nation will expect all individuals and all groups to play their full part without stint, without selfishness, and without doubt that our democracy will triumphantly survive.
But all of America was soon to rise in single-minded wrath behind her commander-in-chief. December 7th, 1941. Without any declaration of war or other warning, Japan attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Was a great shock to the country and a particular personal shock to Mr. Roosevelt because he adored the Navy. And his Navy to be caught like sitting ducks, boats tied up side by side in Pearl Harbor was something he found very, very hard to digest. But the incident was a triumph for him. It settled his constitutional problem.
At the time of the attack, Roosevelt was in the middle of negotiations with Japan, aimed at avoiding war in the Pacific. 4 days later, on December 11th, 1941, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. There was no question now of Roosevelt having to lead a divided country into a European conflict. A world war was thrust on the American people by all of democracy's foes, and the full power of the strongest nation in the world was immediately placed at the disposal of its commander-in-chief.
He was now a war chief. He really enjoyed his role as commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy. But he did not meddle in the conduct of the war. He left to officers whom he personally selected and in whom he had a great deal of faith, although he went to all the big meetings. And he liked to sit there and read the maps and so on, but he might make a suggestion, but I'm sure he told them to pay no attention to what he's saying. At least it indicated he was not going to insist on these things, and they knew he wouldn't.
America and Britain were now allies. Personal meetings between the two warlords, Roosevelt and Churchill, laid the basis for joint planning by their chiefs of staff. Russia was now also America's ally. The presence of Stalin at Tehran in 1943 made it a meeting of the Big Three. Roosevelt loved these summit conferences, but Stalin and Churchill knew that in Europe at least, there were political objectives to be fought for in addition to military victory. Roosevelt exercised undisputed authority as commander-in-chief. As American forces fought their long and hard way back across the Pacific to the Philippines, Congress was happy to leave America's military and diplomatic policies in the hands of the president. Some Americans felt that the war against Japan should have priority over the war in Europe, but there was no serious opposition to Roosevelt's handling of the big decisions of the alliance. He and Churchill had agreed at the outset that Germany had to be defeated first. Japan would not last long on her own. In 1944, Roosevelt won power for a fourth term. The return to active political warfare stimulated him, but his health was weakening. When he reported to Congress on his return from the Yalta Conference, he was a dying man.
I hope in our history, and therefore in the history of the world, there will soon be presented to the Senate and the American people a great decision that will determine the fate of the United States, and I think, therefore, the fate of the world, for generations to come. There can be no middle ground here. We shall have to take the responsibility for world collaboration. or we shall have to bear the responsibility for another world conflict. And I am confident that the Congress and the American people will accept the results of this conference as the beginnings of a permanent structure of peace, upon which we can begin to build, under God, that better world in which our children and grandchildren, yours and mine, the children and grandchildren of the whole world, must live and can live.
Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945. The nation was stunned. He had been their president for 12 1/4 years.
Under the protection of the federal government, he brought in the human being. That was one of the great things he did. He had a great feeling for the human being. Where he got it, I don't know. He did not come up the hard way. He could be patronizing. I thought a lot of times he was, having in mind, of course, his own beginnings. But you've got to take a man, I suppose, on his record. And on his record, he was a champion of the poor. Well, Roosevelt, I think, was the greatest user of power, the greatest president, too, in our modern time. He made a game of acquiring power. He made a skillful job, did a skillful job of using it. He used it, I think, for very noble purposes, although his methods were not always as noble.